So this one time in World War II, the Japanese launched what was known as Operation Seigo, also known as the Zhejiang Jiangxi campaign. Basically, between the months of May and September 1942, the Japanese army in China decided to move into and occupy the provinces of Zhejiang and Jiangxi. They had already had plans to move into these provinces in order to capture strategically valuable uh, airways or airfields, rather. They wanted to capture strategically valuable airfields, which the Chinese or someone else in the area might use to bomb the main island of Japan. And then, of course, the Doolittle Raid occurred, which we discussed in a previous video. Details or link to in the doobly doo. But basically, the Americans bombed Tokyo, Kobe, Yokohama, etc. And due to lack of fuel, they had to crash land into the Zhejiang and Jiangxi provinces of China, where normally they would have flown on and landed, later to be evacuated. Didn't work out. They had to crash land, and they went into hiding in those provinces. And so, the original Japanese plan to take these airfields evolved into retribution for that Doolittle raid. And not only did the Doolittle raid escalate the time frame for the Operation Seigo, it also escalated the intensity at which it would be carried out at the personal level. The result was the kind of inhumane brutality that characterized the Japanese Empire during World War II. That is to say, rape, murder, looting, complete destruction of anything and everything that they could get their hands on. And these atrocities are reported both by journalists that came to visit the areas, as well as foreign missionaries who had helped the people before, during, and after this occupation. Um, and so the result of this was by Chinese estimates, some 250,000 people killed. Those numbers are a bit fuzzy because due to the chaos leading up to, during, and after the campaign, it's really hard to corroborate those numbers. However, I don't think that that's all that important. I don't think that the exact number of people dead matters all that much when compared to the big picture issue of the Japanese Empire committing atrocities in China, as they had done and continue to do throughout World War II. So, during the months of May to September, the Japanese occupied and burnt and destroyed everything that they could in order to locate and capture the American pilots who had taken part in the Doolittle Raid. They did find some. Some were executed, some were taken prisoners. Of those prisoners, some died to disease and exposure. But the real human cost of this campaign would be paid for by the Chinese. Again, that 250,000 number. And those that paid most extremely were those who had helped the American pilots directly. In many cases, those pilots had given the Chinese gifts or trinkets, so like cigarette packets or American coin change. And those gifts, which were given to show, given as thank yous for the help that the pilots had received, would later go on to be very damning, as the Japanese military would know that those people who held those things had been directly involved with the American pilots. And when those 3 months of destruction were over, the Japanese decided that they were they were finished with the operation. They were going to move out. They brought in the now infamous Unit 731, a Japanese biological warfare research division, which we'll talk about more in a different video. But for now, just know that they were researching and indeed practicing biological warfare on Chinese civilians. And so, as the Japanese army withdrew from Zhejiang and Jiangxi, Unit 731 joined them and contaminated the area by infecting water supplies, food supplies, spraying down the grounds and the rubble, all of this with different bacteria. And infected fleas, or well, fleas infected with bacteria, most namely plague, typhoid, paratyphoid, cholera, dysentery, and anthrax. Some reports show that the Japanese used some 300 pounds of anthrax and paratyphoid bacteria during this time. Uh, and this, of course, would affect, it actually affected Japanese military who were in the area at the time, but the intended use was to infect the Chinese civilians and the Chinese military that would move into the area to reoccupy it once the Japanese had withdrew. They would even leave supplies of food rations in strategically placed locations to make it look as though the Japanese had left them behind in a hurry, as though they hadn't been able to get everything out during their withdrawal process. And then, of course, the Chinese would move in. They would eat or interact with this contaminated substances and then contract these various diseases. They would also, the Japanese would infect prisoners of war and then release them, knowing that they would go home to spread these diseases further. And again, this all just adds to the confusion of that casualty number, because the casualties not only stem from the direct results, but also from the larger results over time as these infections and diseases killed off more and more people. So all of this was performed under the command of a man named Shunroku Hata, who, after the end of the war, would be captured and imprisoned and charged with and found guilty of war crimes, specifically failure to prevent atrocities by his men during this time period, and he would be sentenced to life imprisonment in 1948. However, he would be released on parole in 1956 and would die a free man. So, again, we talked about the Doolittle Raid in a previous video, and how the result of that was increased morale among the Americans and decreased morale in the Japanese. But the largest and most direct result is, of course, the loss of life in mainland China. And so while the Doolittle Raid did, or was responsible for, in part, for a series of actions that would lead the Japanese to commit themselves in the Pacific and eventually lead to the Battle of Midway, which would, of course, tip the scales in the Americans' favor in the war in the Pacific and lead to the Imperial Japanese defeat. Was that worth it when compared to the tragedies that occurred in China as a result? I'll let you guys argue about it in the comments, but at the very least, you now have a conversational knowledge of Operation Seigo and the Zhejiang Jiangxi campaign.